The Japanese millionaire looked around, desperate for someone to notice her. No one did. No one understood. Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, and I've been carrying trays and carrying burdens for 37 years. 37 years of aching feet, forced smiles, and invisible tears. The Sterling Room on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. That's where my story takes place. A place where millionaires sip champagne while I polish their forgotten crumbs from crystal glasses. Where fortunes are discussed over appetizers while I scurry between tables, collecting their discarded napkins and swallowing their casual cruelty. I remember that September evening like it was branded into my memory. The restaurant's golden chandeliers cast their warm glow over cold hearts. The scent of truffle oil and imported wine mingled with my quiet desperation. My uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, felt heavier than usual that night. My hands, weathered from years of scrubbing dishes and wiping tables, trembled slightly as I adjusted my hairnet for the 100th time. The Sterling Room wasn't just any restaurant. It was where Wall Street executives celebrated their latest stock market victories, where cryptocurrency millionaires flaunted their Bitcoin portfolios over dinner, where old money met new money and both looked down on people like me. I'd overheard conversations about investments worth more than I'd earn in 10 lifetimes. Assets discussed like grocery lists, business deals sealed with handshakes and Bordeaux. But that night, something different walked through those mahogany doors. She was small, elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Her designer suit spoke of wealth, but her eyes held the same loneliness I recognized in my own mirror. Ms. Akiko Takahashi, as I would later learn, was one of Japan's most successful tech entrepreneurs. Her portfolio included revolutionary software patents, cryptocurrency investments that had multiplied her fortune tenfold, and real estate holdings across 3 continents. She entered with a delegation of American businessmen, men whose laughter boomed across the dining room like thunder, men who saw dollar signs before they saw human faces. I watched from behind the service counter as they were seated at table 12, the prime spot by the window overlooking Central Park. Ms. Takahashi sat quietly, her hands folded, while her companions dominated the conversation in rapid English. I'd been working double shifts for 3 months straight. My daughter Sarah needed money for her final semester at Columbia. The medical bills from my mother's last hospital stay were still piling up on my kitchen table. Every tip, every extra hour, every swallowed insult went toward keeping my family afloat. The American dream, they call it. More like the American drowning, if you ask me. My manager, Robert Henley, was a man who measured success in profit margins and customer satisfaction scores. His eyes were always calculating, always cold. He ruled the Sterling Room with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. "Remember, Margaret," he'd tell me, "these people can buy and sell you 100 times over. Smile, nod, and disappear." That was his philosophy. Make the wealthy comfortable by making yourself invisible. The evening started like any other. I served appetizers, refilled wine glasses, and practiced the art of selective deafness when customers made rude comments. But at table 12, something was wrong. Ms. Takahashi tried multiple times to get the attention of her dinner companions. She would start to speak, and they would talk over her. She would ask a question, and they would ignore her. She would reach for the wine bottle, and they would move it away without looking. I watched this happening and felt something twist in my stomach, a familiar ache. The same feeling I got when my own daughter would come home from school and barely acknowledge my existence before disappearing into her room. The same emptiness I felt when my ex-husband would discuss our finances as if I wasn't sitting right there at the table. One of the businessmen, a loud man with a red tie and too much cologne, was explaining some complex investment strategy. "The key is diversification," he bellowed, waving his fork dramatically. "Stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency, real estate. That's how you build generational wealth." Ms. Takahashi nodded and tried to interject with what sounded like an insightful comment about market volatility in Asia, but he simply continued talking as if she were a piece of furniture. The menu at the Sterling Room was extensive and entirely in English. I noticed Ms. Takahashi studying it with a slight frown, occasionally asking quiet questions that went unanswered. Her companions had already ordered, making decisions for the table without consulting her. They chose wines she didn't drink, appetizers she couldn't eat, and main courses that ignored her dietary preferences entirely. I knew that feeling. The feeling of being present but not included, of having opinions that don't matter and preferences that don't count. I'd lived it in my marriage, in my workplace, sometimes even in my own home. Standing there in that expensive restaurant, watching this powerful woman shrink into herself, I felt a connection that transcended language and culture and social class. During my 10-minute break, I stepped outside into the cool September air. The city was alive around me, yellow cabs honking, people rushing home from work, the distant sound of construction and commerce that never sleeps. But my mind was on that quiet woman at table 12. Something about her reminded me of myself 20 years ago, when I still believed that hard work and kindness would eventually be rewarded. I'd married young to a man who promised me the world but delivered only expectations. He wanted a wife who would advance his career, raise his children, and never ask for anything in return. I became an expert at making myself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient. When he left me for a younger woman, I was almost relieved. At least I could stop pretending to be happy. The restaurant industry isn't kind to women like me. We're too old to be eye candy, too tired to be perky, too experienced to be naive. But I was good at what I did. I remembered orders, anticipated needs, and moved through that dining room like a ghost who brought exactly what you wanted before you knew you wanted it. If that wasn't valuable, what was? Back inside, the situation at table 12 had deteriorated. Ms. Takahashi was staring at her untouched plate while her companions debated the merits of different cryptocurrency exchanges. Bitcoin this, Ethereum that, blockchain technology, revolutionizing finance. They spoke about millions of dollars like I spoke about grocery money. The irony wasn't lost on me that this woman, who probably had more wealth than everyone else in the room combined, was being treated like an afterthought. The red tie man was getting louder and more obnoxious with each glass of wine. "You know what the problem is with foreign investors?" he declared, gesturing broadly. "They don't understand American business culture. They're too polite, too indirect. In America, you have to speak up or get left behind." I saw Ms. Takahashi's face flush slightly, but she said nothing. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the obvious discomfort. I wondered what she was thinking. I wondered if she felt as invisible as I did most days. The breaking point came when she politely asked about dessert options. The waitress assigned to their table, a young woman named Jessica who treated wealthy customers like celebrities, barely glanced at Ms. Takahashi before launching into an elaborate description of the restaurant's signature chocolate soufflé. She spoke too fast, used complicated culinary terms, and showed obvious impatience when Ms. Takahashi asked for clarification. "Look," Jessica finally said with a condescending smile, "maybe you'd prefer something simpler? We have vanilla ice cream." The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. She might as well have patted Ms. Takahashi on the head and offered her a coloring book. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I was refilling water glasses at a nearby table when I heard Ms. Takahashi whisper something in Japanese. It sounded like a prayer or perhaps a quiet expression of frustration. Without thinking, I walked over to table 12 and, in my rusty but heartfelt Japanese, said, "Excuse me, may I help you with anything?" The effect was immediate and electric. Ms. Takahashi looked up at me with eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like relief. The loud businessman stopped talking mid-sentence. Jessica's mouth fell slightly open. The entire dining room seemed to pause, as if a record had skipped. You speak Japanese?" Ms. Takahashi asked, still in her native language. "A little," I replied, also in Japanese. "I studied it many years ago when my daughter was interested in Japanese culture. I'm out of practice, but I thought you might like someone to explain the menu properly." For the first time all evening, Ms. Takahashi smiled. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. We spent the next few minutes going through the dessert options, and I explained not just the ingredients, but the preparation methods and the restaurant's reputation for each dish. Her face lit up with understanding and appreciation. The businessmen watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. They weren't used to being upstaged by the help. The red tie man cleared his throat loudly. "Well, that's interesting," he said with forced joviality. "I didn't know the staff here was so international." But Ms. Takahashi was no longer paying attention to him. She was asking me questions about the wine pairings, about the chef's background, about the restaurant's history. For those few minutes, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was engaged, animated, present in a way she hadn't been all evening. I should have known there would be consequences. In places like the Sterling Room, the help isn't supposed to have opinions or skills or languages beyond their designated roles. We're supposed to be efficient and anonymous. I had broken the unspoken rule by being human. The next morning, I was called into Robert Henley's office. It was a small, windowless room behind the kitchen that smelled of industrial sanitizer and broken dreams. He sat behind his metal desk with my employee file open in front of him, his expression as warm as a tax audit. "Margaret," he began without preamble, "we need to discuss last night." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. "Is there a problem, sir?" "There were complaints about your behavior at table 12, specifically that you were overly familiar with the guests, that you disrupted their dining experience with inappropriate conversation." I stared at him in disbelief. I was helping a customer understand the menu. Isn't that part of customer service? Your job is to serve food and clear tables, not to entertain guests with language lessons. His voice was cold, clinical. "We've also had questions raised about some discrepancies in your table receipts, money that doesn't add up correctly." My blood turned to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we can't afford to have employees who can't be trusted. Your last day will be tomorrow. You can finish your shifts through the weekend, and then we'll be parting ways." The injustice hit me like a physical blow. I had given 7 years of my life to that restaurant. 7 years of double shifts, skipped meals, and swallowed pride. 7 years of making wealthy people comfortable while I struggled to pay my own bills. And now they were suggesting I was a thief? "Those receipts are wrong because of a computer glitch we've reported multiple times," I said, my voice barely steady. "You know that." "We've all complained about the system errors." "That's your story," Robert replied, shuffling papers dismissively. "But the customers at table 12 felt you were acting inappropriately, making them uncomfortable with your performance." Performance. As if showing basic human kindness was some kind of theatrical act. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream about the unfairness, about the way I'd watched wealthy customers berate younger servers until they cried, about the times I'd covered shifts for coworkers who called in sick with hangovers, about the years I'd spent making this place successful while living paycheck to paycheck. But what was the point? Who would believe a middle-aged waitress over a successful manager and wealthy customers? Who would care about my version of events? I cleaned out my locker and walked out of the Sterling Room for the last time. My apron, which had felt so heavy for so many years, suddenly felt like nothing at all. Just fabric holding together the remnants of a life that no longer existed. The weeks that followed were brutal. Finding restaurant work at my age isn't easy, especially without a reference from your most recent employer. I applied everywhere. Diners, coffee shops, hotel restaurants, Most places took one look at my graying hair and tired eyes and thanked me for my interest before showing me the door. I had to swallow my pride and ask my daughter Sarah for help with rent. The conversation was humiliating in ways I couldn't have imagined. She listened with the distracted air of someone solving a minor inconvenience, then transferred money to my account with a sigh. "Mom," she said, "maybe it's time to think about something more sustainable. You can't wait tables forever." As if I hadn't been thinking about that every day for the past decade. As if I had endless other options just waiting for me to choose them. My unemployment benefits were barely enough to cover groceries. I started shopping at discount stores, clipping coupons, calculating every purchase down to the penny. Pride, I learned, was a luxury I could no longer afford. The worst part was the silence. After 37 years in the restaurant business, I was used to noise. The clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, the constant motion of service. Now my days stretched empty and quiet, filled with job applications and rejections, and the growing fear that I might truly be invisible after all. I thought about Ms. Takahashi sometimes. I wondered if she even remembered the encounter that had cost me my job. I wondered if she knew what had happened to me afterward. Most likely she had returned to Japan and her empire of technology investments and cryptocurrency portfolios. And the lonely waitress who spoke a few words of Japanese was just a forgotten curiosity. 3 months after I was fired, I was working part-time at a small diner in Queens, making half what I'd earned at the Sterling Room and grateful to have even that. The customers were different here. Working people like myself, families stretching their budgets, elderly men who made their coffee last for hours just to have somewhere to sit. It was a Thursday afternoon in December when she walked in. I almost didn't recognize her without the designer suit and perfect hair. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and she looked around the diner with the same lost expression I'd seen that night at the Sterling Room. Our eyes met across the narrow dining room, and I saw recognition dawn in her face. She walked over to my section and sat at a corner booth, studying the plastic menu with what looked like amusement. "Hello, Margaret," she said in English, then switched to Japanese. "I've been looking for you." My hands were shaking as I poured her coffee. "Looking for me? Why?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. "Because I need to show you something, and I need to apologize." What she showed me changed everything. She had recorded the entire conversation in Robert Henley's office the day after our encounter. She had gone to the Sterling Room to thank me personally for my kindness, only to be told that I no longer worked there. When she pressed for details, Robert had been surprisingly forthcoming about his reasons for firing me. She was getting too familiar with the customers, his voice came through the tiny speaker, overstepping boundaries, and there were some financial irregularities we couldn't ignore. But Ms. Takahashi hadn't accepted that explanation. She had done something I would never have expected. She had investigated. Using her business connections and considerable resources, she had uncovered the truth about the Sterling Room's accounting system. The discrepancies in my receipts weren't discrepancies at all. They were evidence of systematic skimming by management. Robert Henley had been stealing from the restaurant for 2 years, manipulating the point-of-sale system to hide cash transactions and blame shortfalls on server errors. I wasn't the first employee to be fired under suspicious circumstances. I was just the most recent scapegoat in a pattern of theft and deception. "I have all the evidence," Ms. Takahashi told me quietly. "Bank records, system logs, testimony from other former employees. Your manager was stealing thousands of dollars, and when you became inconvenient, he decided to frame you." I sat in stunned silence, listening to the proof of my innocence and Robert's guilt. All those months of shame and self-doubt, all those nights wondering if I really had made some terrible mistake, all those job interviews where I couldn't fully explain why I'd left my previous position. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you do this for me?" She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Because," she said finally, You saw me when no one else did. You treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like an inconvenience. In my business, that's rarer than you might think." She went on to explain that she had built her fortune through technology patents and strategic investments, including early positions in cryptocurrency that had made her incredibly wealthy. But wealth, she had learned, often came with isolation. People saw her money before they saw her humanity. They calculated her net worth while ignoring her worth as a person. "That night at the Sterling Room," she said, "I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming less real with every ignored comment and dismissive glance. And then you spoke to me in my own language, and suddenly I existed again." The irony was overwhelming. Here was a woman with assets in the hundreds of millions, stock portfolios that most people could only dream of, business interests spanning continents, and she had felt as invisible and dismissed as I did on my worst days. She had used her resources to investigate not out of revenge, but out of recognition. She understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, treated as less than human. The difference was that she had the power to do something about it. "What happens now?" I asked. She smiled, the same genuine smile I remembered from that night at the Sterling Room. "Now we fix things, for you and for all the other employees who were wronged." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of lawyers, meetings, and revelations. Ms. Takahashi had hired a forensic accounting firm to audit the Sterling Room's books. What they found was even worse than we had imagined. Robert Henley hadn't just been skimming cash. He had been manipulating everyone's hours, pocketing service charges, and even stealing from the employee health insurance fund. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Robert was arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The Sterling Room's ownership was forced to acknowledge years of wage theft and unfair terminations. Several other former employees came forward with similar stories of being scapegoated to cover management's crimes. I was offered my job back with full back pay and benefits, plus compensation for the months I had been unemployed. The apology from the owners was formal and legal, carefully worded by attorneys, but it was still an apology. More importantly, Ms. Takahashi offered me something else entirely. She was opening a new restaurant in Brooklyn, a place that would serve both American and Japanese cuisine to bridge the cultural gap she had felt so acutely. She wanted me to be her general manager. "I need someone who understands service," she explained, "not just the mechanics of taking orders and serving food, but the humanity of it. Someone who sees people instead of profit margins." The restaurant opened 6 months later. We called it Bridge. Simple, direct, meaningful. It wasn't as fancy as the Sterling Room, but it was warm and welcoming in ways that money can't buy. The staff was diverse, experienced, and treated with respect. Tips were shared fairly, schedules were reasonable, and no one was ever fired for showing kindness to a customer. My first day as manager was surreal. Instead of carrying trays, I was carrying keys. Instead of taking orders, I was giving them. Instead of disappearing into the background, I was front and center, responsible for creating the kind of workplace I had always wished I could find. The strangest moment came 3 weeks after we opened, when some familiar faces walked through the door. A group of businessmen from Manhattan, including the red-tie man from that night at the Sterling Room. They didn't recognize me at first. Managers dressed differently than waitresses, apparently. They ordered expensive wine and complained about the prices. They spoke loudly about their latest cryptocurrency investments and stock options. They treated our servers with the same casual dismissiveness I remembered so well. And then one of them asked to speak to the manager about some trivial complaint. I walked over to their table with a professional smile, introduced myself, and watched recognition dawn in their eyes. "Wait," the red-tie man said. Didn't you used to work at the Sterling Room?" "I did," I replied calmly. "I was fired for doing my job too well. How can I help you gentlemen today?" The complaint disappeared. They finished their meal quickly and left an unusually large tip. Word travels fast in Manhattan business circles, and within a month, Bridge had become an unlikely power dining destination. Not because we courted wealthy customers, but because we treated everyone with equal dignity. Ms. Takahashi and I became true friends over those months. She taught me about business management and investment strategies, how to read financial reports and plan for growth. I taught her about American dining customs and the art of creating genuine hospitality. She had me open my first investment account, a small portfolio of stocks and index funds that she helped me choose. Financial independence, she said, isn't just about having money, it's about having choices. For the first time in my adult life, I was earning enough to save money instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. The employee profit-sharing plan meant that when Bridge succeeded, I succeeded too. My daughter Sarah was amazed when I started giving her financial advice instead of asking for financial help. The most satisfying moment came almost a year later, when Robert Henley was sentenced to 5 years in prison for embezzlement. The judge noted that his crimes had affected not just the restaurant's owners, but all the employees whose livelihoods had been damaged by his deception. Justice isn't always swift or certain, but sometimes it arrives exactly when you need it most. Today, Bridge employs 46 people and serves over 300 customers daily. We've been featured in food magazines and dining guides, not for our luxury, but for our authenticity. Ms. Takahashi's investment in kindness has paid dividends that can't be measured in dollars and cents. I think about that night at the Sterling Room often, how a few words in Japanese change the trajectory of 2 lives, how recognition and respect can be more valuable than any tip, how the invisible servants of the world carry more strength and dignity than anyone realizes. My story isn't unique. In diners and coffee shops across this country, there are women like me serving people who never really see them. They're raising families on minimum wage plus tips, dealing with rude customers and impossible schedules, carrying the weight of other people's comfort while their own comfort goes unnoticed. But we're not as powerless as we might feel. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see us, to hear us, to recognize our humanity. Sometimes justice comes disguised as friendship, and redemption arrives through the simple act of being kind. I still work at Bridge, but now I work because I choose to, not because I have to. I've trained other managers and helped launch 2 additional locations. Ms. Takahashi has become not just my business partner, but my closest friend. And together we've created something that feeds both bodies and souls. The Sterling Room closed permanently last year. The wage theft scandal and criminal charges destroyed its reputation beyond repair. The building now houses a community health clinic, which seems fitting somehow. A place that once served only the wealthy now serves everyone who needs care. But let me tell you more about what happened after Bridge became successful, because that's where the real lessons began. Success, I learned, brings its own challenges and responsibilities. Within our first year, we started receiving calls from other restaurant workers who had heard about our story. Women like Maria, a single mother who had been working at a chain restaurant for 8 years without ever getting promoted, despite training every new manager who walked through the door. Men like Carlos, who had been collecting unemployment after being fired from his head chef position when he refused to use expired ingredients. Ms. Takahashi and I realized we had an opportunity to do more than just run a successful restaurant. We could create a model for how the service industry should treat its workers. We started hosting monthly meetings for hospitality workers, offering free training in financial literacy, management skills, and workers' rights. The first meeting drew 12 people. Within 6 months, we were renting community center space to accommodate over 100 attendees. The stories we heard were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Age discrimination, wage theft, sexual harassment, unsafe working conditions. All the problems I had experienced and witnessed throughout my career were systemic issues affecting thousands of workers across the city. One woman, Elena, told us about working at an upscale restaurant in Midtown where the manager required female servers to wear makeup and heels, then dock their pay for uniform violations if their appearance wasn't deemed attractive enough. She had worked there for 3 years, developing varicose veins and chronic back pain, before finally quitting when she realized she was making less per hour after uniform costs than she would at minimum wage. Another man, David, described working at a hotel restaurant where the management routinely scheduled servers for 39 hours per week to avoid paying benefits, then demanded they stay late for private events without overtime compensation. When he tried to organize his co-workers to negotiate better conditions, he was fired for attitude problems. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of an industry that had normalized the exploitation of its workforce. Restaurant workers, particularly women and immigrants, were treated as disposable resources rather than human beings with families, dreams, and basic rights. Ms. Takahashi listened to these testimonies with the same intensity she brought to business meetings. She took notes, asked questions, and began developing what she called her Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive plan to revolutionize working conditions throughout the hospitality industry. The initiative started small. We partnered with local restaurants to provide consulting services, helping them restructure their operations to prioritize employee welfare without sacrificing profitability. We showed them how proper scheduling, fair compensation, and respectful management actually improved customer service and reduced costly staff turnover. Some businesses embraced these changes enthusiastically. Others resisted, claiming that treating workers better would drive them out of business. That's exactly the point, Ms. Takahashi would tell them. If your business model depends on exploiting your employees, you don't deserve to stay in business. We also started a microloan program for restaurant workers who wanted to start their own businesses. The loans were small, usually between $5,000 and $15,000, but they came with business mentorship and financial counseling. We helped former servers open food trucks, bartenders launch catering companies, and kitchen staff start their own restaurants. One of our first loan recipients was Jessica, the same young waitress who had been so dismissive to Ms. Takahashi that night at the Sterling Room. She approached us hesitantly at one of our monthly meetings, embarrassed about her past behavior but desperate to change her circumstances. "I was horrible that night," she admitted, tears in her eyes. "I was so focused on getting big tips from the businessmen that I didn't see Ms. Takahashi as a real person. I'm ashamed of how I acted." Jessica had been struggling financially since the Sterling Room closed. She was supporting her sick mother and younger brother while trying to finish community college. The stress had made her bitter and desperate, leading to the kind of behavior she now regretted. We gave her a loan to start a small bakery specializing in Japanese American fusion desserts, a concept inspired by her experience at Bridge. But more importantly, we gave her a chance to redeem herself and build something meaningful. Her bakery, Sweet Bridge, became one of our most successful partnerships. Jessica hired other former service workers and implemented the same fair labor practices we used at our restaurant. She also volunteered at our monthly meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to pursue their entrepreneurial dreams. The ripple effects of our work began extending beyond the restaurant industry. Ms. Takahashi used her connections in the tech world to advocate for gig economy workers, drivers, delivery workers, and freelancers who faced many of the same challenges as restaurant staff. She testified before city council committees, wrote op-eds for major newspapers, and used her considerable wealth to lobby for legislative changes. I found myself becoming an unlikely activist, me, a middle-aged former waitress, speaking at conferences and workshops about labor rights and economic justice. The same woman who had been invisible for so many years was now quoted in newspapers and invited to appear on television programs. The irony wasn't lost on me. My decades of invisibility had given me insights that powerful people desperately needed to hear. I understood the daily indignities that working people faced because I had lived them. I could speak about economic inequality not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. One of the most powerful moments came when I was invited to speak at a conference for restaurant investors and franchise owners. These were the people who made millions of dollars from the labor of servers and cooks while treating workers as expendable commodities. I stood before an audience of men in expensive suits, men very much like the ones who had dismissed Ms. Takahashi that night at the Sterling Room, and told them exactly what their business practices were costing in human terms. I described the servers who couldn't afford to eat at the restaurants where they worked, the kitchen staff who suffered burns and cuts because proper safety equipment was too expensive, the single mothers who chose between paying rent and taking their children to the doctor. The room was uncomfortably silent when I finished speaking. Several audience members walked out, but others approached me afterward, asking genuine questions about how they could implement better practices in their own businesses. Change, I learned, often comes slowly and meets resistance at every step. But it does come, especially when people with resources and platforms decide to use their power responsibly. Ms. Takahashi's wealth gave our movement credibility and resources, but it was the stories of ordinary workers that gave it moral authority. The combination was powerful. We could provide concrete solutions backed by financial support and real-world experience. Our work attracted attention from labor organizations and social justice groups across the country. We received invitations to expand our programs to other cities. We were featured in documentaries about economic inequality and workers' rights. But the most meaningful moments were still the small, personal ones, like when Maria finally got promoted to assistant manager at her restaurant after her employer attended one of our workshops, or when Carlos opened his own catering company and hired 5 other unemployed chefs, or when Elena started a support group for hospitality workers dealing with harassment and discrimination. These individual victories might not make headlines, but they represented real people reclaiming their dignity and building better lives for themselves and their families. As Bridge continued to grow, we opened our 3rd location in the Bronx, specifically choosing a neighborhood where good jobs were scarce and many residents struggled with food insecurity. We partnered with local schools to provide internships and job training for young people who might not otherwise have opportunities in the hospitality industry. We also started a program called Community Tables, where we provided free meals to unemployed workers, seniors on fixed incomes, and families facing temporary hardships. The program was funded through profits from our regular operations and donations from customers who wanted to support our mission. One evening, while I was supervising the dinner service at our Brooklyn location, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was Robert Henley, recently released from prison and looking considerably older and more haggard than I remembered. My first instinct was anger, but it quickly gave way to something more complex. Here was a man who had cost me my job, stolen from hard-working employees, and caused tremendous pain and financial hardship for countless people. Yet he also looked broken, defeated, genuinely remorseful. He approached me hesitantly, clearly unsure of his reception. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask, but could I speak with you for a few minutes?" I could have had him escorted out. I could have called the police. I could have publicly humiliated him the way he had humiliated me. Instead, I led him to a quiet corner booth and listened to what he had to say. "I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "Not just for firing you unjustly, but for everything. The stealing, the lies, the way I treated all of you. Prison gave me time to think about the damage I caused, and I'm ashamed of who I became." He went on to explain that his theft had started small, a few dollars here and there to cover gambling debts, but once it became easier to justify taking more. When employees like me started asking questions or becoming inconvenient, he had convinced himself that we were the problem. "I know an apology doesn't undo the damage," he said, "but I needed you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened. You didn't deserve any of it." I sat quietly for a moment, processing his words and my own feelings. Part of me was still angry about the months of unemployment and shame I had endured because of his actions. But another part of me recognized that holding on to that anger would only poison my own life. "Thank you for the apology," I finally said. "I accept it. But what matters now is what you do going forward." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm trying to find work, but it's difficult with my record. I just wanted you to know that seeing what you and Ms. Takahashi have built, it gives me hope that I can find a way to contribute something positive too." I made a decision that surprised even myself. "Are you familiar with our community tables program?" I asked. When he shook his head, I explained how we provided free meals and job counseling to people facing difficult circumstances. "We could use volunteers," I said. "People who understand what it means to lose everything and want to help others avoid the same mistakes." Robert's face showed a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You would trust me to work with people in need?" "I would trust you to serve food and clean tables," I replied. "The trust for anything more would have to be earned over time. But everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life, as long as they're genuinely committed to doing better." He started volunteering the next week, working in our kitchen during the community tables service. He was quiet, hardworking, and grateful for the opportunity. He never asked for special treatment or tried to leverage his former management experience. He just served food, cleaned dishes, and listened to the stories of people who were struggling. Over time, he became one of our most dedicated volunteers. He understood the shame and desperation that came with losing everything, and he could connect with our clients in ways that other volunteers couldn't. Several people who had been fired unjustly found comfort in talking to someone who had caused similar pain and was genuinely seeking redemption. His transformation wasn't immediate or complete. He still struggled with the consequences of his actions, and there were days when the weight of his guilt was almost unbearable. But gradually, through service to others, he began to rebuild not just his life, but his sense of self-worth. This experience taught me something important about forgiveness and second chances. I had spent months hating Robert Henley for what he had done to me, but holding on to that hatred had only made my own pain worse. Choosing to forgive him didn't excuse his actions or minimize their impact, but it freed me from carrying that burden. Ms. Takahashi was initially skeptical about involving Robert in our programs. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" she asked. "He caused tremendous harm." "Yes, he did," I replied. "But isn't transformation exactly what we're trying to achieve? If we only help people who haven't made serious mistakes, we're not really changing the system." She eventually came to see the wisdom in this approach. Robert's journey from exploiter to advocate became a powerful example of how people could change when given proper support and accountability. As our movement grew, we began receiving recognition from unexpected sources. The mayor's office honored our restaurants as model employers. Business schools started using Bridge as a case study in ethical management practices. I was invited to join the board of a national organization focused on workers' rights. But the recognition that meant the most came from the people whose lives had been touched by our work. The former servers who had become managers, the kitchen workers who had started their own businesses, the single mothers who no longer had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. These were the real measures of our success, not the awards or media attention, but the individual lives that had been transformed through opportunities, dignity, and hope. Ms. Takahashi and I often reflected on how our unlikely friendship had blossomed from a moment of simple human kindness. Two women from vastly different backgrounds, united by the experience of being overlooked and undervalued. Together, we had created something that neither of us could have achieved alone. "You know," she told me one evening, as we reviewed the financial reports from our latest community tables event, "that night at the Sterling Room changed my life just as much as it changed yours." "How so?" I asked. It reminded me that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a bank statement. Money only has meaning when it's used to improve lives and create opportunities. You gave me a mission, Margaret. You showed me how to turn my resources into something meaningful. I smiled, thinking about all the twists and turns that had brought us to this point. And you showed me that being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the most important changes start with one person simply seeing another person's humanity. Our story continued to evolve and expand. We launched a scholarship program for hospitality workers' children, helping young people access college educations that their families could never have afforded. We opened a training center where experienced workers could learn new skills and advance their careers. We started a cooperative grocery store in an underserved neighborhood, providing good jobs and affordable food to residents. Each new initiative was guided by the same principles that had shaped Bridge: treating people with dignity, creating genuine opportunities for advancement, and recognizing that everyone deserves a chance to build a better life. The grocery store project was particularly meaningful to me. Growing up in a working-class family, I had seen how food insecurity affected entire communities. Families would drive miles to find affordable groceries, or they would shop at corner stores that charged premium prices for basic necessities. Our store, called Community Harvest, was designed to break that cycle. We hired local residents and provided them with living wages and benefits. We sourced produce from urban farms and local suppliers whenever possible. We offered cooking classes and nutrition education to help people make the most of their food budgets. The grand opening was a celebration that brought together hundreds of community members. Children played in the aisles while their parents explored the wide selection of affordable, healthy foods. Elderly residents sat in the cafe area, finally having a comfortable place to socialize and eat a good meal. Ms. Takahashi cut the ribbon with tears in her eyes. "This is what success really looks like," she said to the gathered crowd. "Not fancy offices or expensive cars, but neighbors helping neighbors and communities healing themselves." Standing there among all those happy faces, I thought about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. From the humiliation of being fired for showing kindness, to the desperation of unemployment, to the gradual building of something beautiful and meaningful. The path hadn't been easy. We had faced criticism from competitors who claimed we were naive idealists. We had dealt with regulatory challenges and financial setbacks. We had struggled with the inevitable conflicts that arise when trying to balance idealism with practical business needs. But we had also witnessed miracles. Employees who had never imagined themselves as leaders stepping into management roles. Former customers becoming advocates for workers' rights. Competitors adopting our practices after seeing how much more successful we had become. The restaurant industry was slowly changing, partly because of our efforts, but mostly because workers themselves were demanding better treatment. The old model of exploiting vulnerable people was becoming less sustainable as employees found other options and customers began caring about social responsibility. Our monthly meetings had evolved into a formal organization called the Hospitality Workers Alliance, with chapters in 12 cities and over 3,000 members. We lobbied for legislative changes, provided legal support for workers facing discrimination, and continued offering training and microloan programs. I had become the organization's president, a role I never would have imagined for myself during those long years of carrying trays and absorbing insults. But my experiences as an invisible worker had prepared me perfectly for advocating on behalf of others who felt powerless and overlooked. Speaking at rallies and conferences, I often began with the same message. I spent 37 years being invisible in the restaurant industry, but invisible doesn't mean powerless. Every person serving your food, cleaning your tables, and preparing your meals has a story, dreams, and dignity that deserves respect. Ms. Takahashi continued expanding her business empire, but she did so differently now. Every investment was evaluated not just for profit potential, but for social impact. She funded technology startups led by women and minorities. She supported companies that prioritized environmental sustainability and workers' rights. Her portfolio had grown exponentially over the years we worked together, but she measured her success differently now. The best investment I ever made, she would often say, was in treating people with dignity. The returns on that investment are immeasurable. 3 years after Community Harvest opened, we launched our most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive job training and placement program for formerly incarcerated individuals. We had seen how difficult it was for people like Robert to find meaningful employment after prison, and we wanted to create systematic solutions to that problem. The program, called Second Chances, provided 6 months of intensive training in culinary arts, customer service, and business management. Participants lived in transitional housing and received counseling support to help them reintegrate into society. Most importantly, they were guaranteed job placement with our partner businesses upon successful completion of the program. The first cohort included 24 men and women who had served time for various offenses. Some had been addicted to drugs, others had resorted to theft out of economic desperation, and a few had made violent mistakes they deeply regretted. What they all shared was a genuine desire to rebuild their lives and contribute positively to society. Robert became one of our lead instructors, using his experience with both criminality and redemption to connect with participants who were struggling with shame and hopelessness. His transformation from embezzler to advocate was living proof that people could change when given proper support and opportunities. The program's success rate exceeded our most optimistic projections. 90% of participants found stable employment within 6 months of graduation. More importantly, their recidivism rate was less than 5%, compared to nearly 70% for the general formerly incarcerated population. Sarah, my daughter, had been watching my transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had graduated from Columbia several years earlier and was working as a financial analyst at an investment firm, but she began spending her weekends volunteering with our programs. "Mom," she said to me during one of our monthly dinner dates, "I have to admit something. When you lost your job at the Sterling Room, I was embarrassed. I thought you were too old to start over, and I was worried about having to support you financially." I nodded, remembering how painful those conversations had been. "But watching what you've built with Ms. Takahashi," she continued, "seeing all the lives you've changed and the movement you've created, I've never been more proud to be your daughter. You've shown me what real success looks like." Those words meant more to me than any award or recognition we had received. Having my daughter's respect and understanding felt like final vindication for all the struggles and sacrifices of the past few years. As I approach my 60th birthday, I sometimes marvel at the unlikely direction my life has taken. The woman who spent decades invisible in fancy restaurants is now running multiple businesses and leading a national organization. The person who could barely afford groceries is now able to provide scholarships and microloans to others. But the most profound change isn't in my circumstances. It's in my understanding of what's possible when people choose to see each other's humanity instead of their utility. Ms. Takahashi and I still work together every day, though our relationship has evolved from employer-employee to true partnership. We're planning to open our 5th restaurant location next year, this time in Detroit, where the economic challenges are even greater than what we faced in New York. We're also writing a book together about our experiences, hoping to inspire other unlikely partnerships between people from different backgrounds who share common values. The working title is Bridge Builders: How Kindness Creates Change. The Sterling Room building remains a community health clinic, serving hundreds of patients every month. Sometimes I walk by and remember that night when everything changed, when a simple act of kindness in a second language opened doors I never knew existed. I think about all the servers and kitchen workers still struggling in restaurants across the country, feeling invisible and powerless, wondering if their situations will ever improve. I want them to know that change is possible, that their voices matter, that there are people fighting for their dignity and their rights. But more than that, I want everyone to understand that we're all just one moment of recognition away from transformation. One conversation, one act of kindness, one decision to see someone else's humanity instead of their function. The Japanese millionaire who walked into the Sterling room that night was looking for someone to notice her. What she found was a connection that would change both our lives forever. What started as a simple exchange in a foreign language became a movement that has touched thousands of lives. We're still building bridges between languages and cultures, between different economic classes, between people who have given up hope and those who refuse to stop fighting. Every day brings new challenges, but it also brings new opportunities to prove that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right. It's also the foundation of genuine success. The invisible servants of the world, the people who clean your offices, serve your food, care for your children, and keep society functioning, they're not as powerless as they might feel. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see them, to hear them, to recognize their worth. Sometimes that person is a wealthy entrepreneur with the resources to create change. Sometimes it's a fellow worker willing to stand up and speak out. Sometimes it's a customer who chooses to treat service workers with respect and dignity. But most often, transformation begins with the servants themselves, people who refuse to remain invisible, who find their voices and use them to demand better, who build bridges of understanding across the divides that separate us. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever served others while your own needs went unnoticed? Have you ever been blamed for problems you didn't create or fired for doing the right thing? Your story matters. Your dignity matters. Your humanity matters, even when the world forgets to notice. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another woman who serves with heart and soul. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.